Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with flank steak roulade. That's right, we're going to butterfly, stuff, roll, and braise a cut of beef that's usually never braised, and maybe there's a reason for that. But despite its not awesomely beautiful outside appearance, the inside was absolutely delicious, and so I am deeming this experiment an almost complete success. But anyway, above and beyond appearance and flavor, I think this is definitely a worthwhile technique to learn. And to get started, you're going to need two things: one whole trimmed beef flank steak and a thin, sharp knife. And I'm sorry, people that wanted to use dull, fat knives. That's not going to work here. So we're going to start by cutting into the side of this flank steak. Ideally, your knife is going right into the center. And the key here is to go nice and slowly. And as much as possible, you want to keep that knife perfectly flat on the same plane as the cutting board. All right, so you're not cutting down, you're not cutting up, you're cutting perfectly straight across. And by the way, I should have mentioned right off the bat, you have to butterfly it this way, the long ways. All right, you see the direction that those fibers in the meat are going? It's very crucial that once our roulade is done and we're slicing it, that we're going across those fibers. So it has to be butterflied exactly like this for that to work. But anyway, we're going to carefully continue to slice and butterfly, and there's going to be mistakes. So as usual, do not shoot for perfection. So that's what mine looked like post-cutting. I got a nice hole there, and this is split up there. But it doesn't matter, you're going to see it's going to work perfectly anyway because of this next step. So we'll kind of overlap any tears like that. We'll cover this with plastic, and we'll simply flatten it all out with a meat pounder. And I love the style of pounder you see me using here, but if you don't have one, you could just use a small heavy pot. And as we pound, we're not really trying to make it much thinner. We're basically trying to even everything out. Unless you're some kind of freak in nature, or a sushi chef, there's just no way you can butterfly that and have it all the same thickness. So we're going to give it a little pounding to even it all out. And at that point, we're going to peel off the plastic and start to stuff this with, well, stuff. And we're going to go ahead and start the inside with a nice generous seasoning of kosher salt. And yeah, standard disclaimer, kosher salt looks like a ton on camera. It's really not. And it's a big piece of meat, etc. and so forth. Next up, we'll do some freshly ground black pepper. And then after the pepper, we're going to get a little bit fruity. And I'm going to scatter over some currants. Love the currants. Those are also known as micro raisins. So we'll scatter some of those around. Maybe press them in a little bit so they don't roll when we roll. Next up, I'm going to sprinkle over some plain breadcrumbs. All right, not too much, but I do want to cover the surface. And then next up, we have some freshly chopped Italian parsley. Nice generous scattering of that. Then we'll bring the heat with a little bit of red chili flake and the gratuitous shaking of cayenne. Oh yeah, you're welcome. And then at this point, I'm going to lay down some very, very thin strips of pancetta. And by the way, you may have noticed, I'm going with kind of an Italian theme here, kind of a takeoff on the bruschetta. But again, to reiterate, a roulade is not a recipe, it's a technique. So you stuff this with anything you want. But anyway, after the pancetta, we'll do a little bit of grated Reggiano Parmesan. And these ingredient amounts are going to be kind of tough. It's basically enough to cover. So it might say a couple tablespoons on the blog post, but I have no idea how much it really is. And then before we roll this up, I'm going to give it another very light dusting of breadcrumb. Just a little extra something to soak up all those amazing flavors and juices. And at that point, we're going to start at the bottom. And we're going to roll towards the front. And we're going to roll it up. And if you do need help, ask that friend that took you to the fish concert. They probably have a feel for this. So kind of roll it firmly, but not enough to squeeze everything out, of course. Tucking in the edges if you can. But anyway, we're going to roll that up nice and tight, but not too tight. And then once it's perfectly rolled and looking like that, we're going to unroll it, and we're going to add some pine nuts. And now, of course, you're asking, why did you not add those pine nuts when you did the rest of the stuffing ingredients? Hey, how dare you question my methods? But anyway, we're going to unroll it, add some pine nuts, and roll it back up. Only this time, we're going to leave it rolled, and we're going to tie it. So we're going to turn the meat this way. We're going to, of course, have the seam on the bottom. And all we're going to do is take little pieces of string and make individual ties. This is the easiest butcher tie ever. And all you need to do is twist that string around 4 or 5 times before you pull it tight. And because of the friction on that string, it's going to let you cinch it up beautifully. Check it out. And unless you're short on string, I do like to make a tie every inch or two. And then once that's all tied up, let's go ahead and season the outside with a little salt. And at that point, we're going to go over to the stove, and we're going to go ahead and brown this in our braising pot. So on medium-high heat with a little bit of olive oil, go ahead and brown that on all surfaces. And by the way, if any rogue pine nuts pop up, get them out of the pot. Burned nuts are one of those things that can really cause an off flavor. So if you see a pine nut that could get too brown, pull it out. All right, none of the other stuff in there would cause a problem. And then once that's brown, we're going to go ahead and add some braising liquid. And you can use pretty much anything here. You are the big chief of your beef spleef. But for me, I threw in a splash of white wine, something cheap but drinkable, which of course deglazed the bottom. And in addition to the wine, I'm also going to add a fairly garlicky tomato sauce, some chicken broth, and then just enough water to kind of bring that up to the top of the beef. And because this video is going to be too long already, I'll give you more info about that braising liquid on the blog, although I will admit to putting it in a bay leaf. And at that point, all we're going to do is wait for this to come up to a simmer. And as soon as it does, we will turn our heat down to the lowest setting. We'll go ahead and cover it, and we will slowly let this braise for about 2.5–3 hours, or until it's fork and or knife tender. So I'm going to check mine here, and it seemed perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that out and let it rest on a plate at least 10 minutes before I slice it. And yes, of course, you're going to reserve that braising liquid and reduce it and use it as a sauce. But anyway, we're going to let that rest for about 10 minutes, and then it's time to slice. And I was pretty excited at this point because it smelled so good. So I cut in, and while the outside was pretty ugly, I was hoping the inside would be beautiful, and it was. Check it out. Like I said, this was an experiment for me because I'd never butterflied and braised a flank steak before. So I cut myself 3 nice slices. I served that with a couple side dishes I don't remember. I spooned over a little bit of that braising liquid, and that beef flank steak roulade is done and ready for examination. So first up, the taste test. It had a beautiful flavor, but more importantly, it had a great texture. Just melt in your mouth. So taste was great, internal appearance was great. The only thing I didn't like was the outside. Because flank steak does have those long, very pronounced meat fibers, those kind of got a little frayed on the outside, and you can see the edges have kind of a stringy, not absolutely beautiful look to them. And while I wasn't totally thrilled with how the outside looked, I think we can fix that in the next version. Maybe we'll do some kind of pancetta or prosciutto exoskeleton. But anyway, regardless of the specific recipe, still a worthwhile technique to learn, and I really do hope you give it a try sometime. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.